The film never showed the plantations at dawn. Endless rows of banana trees, stretching into a suffocating green horizon. The air thick with humidity, insects humming like distant machinery. Men moved silently through the fields, machetes in hand, cutting fruit that would never belong to them. It looked like agriculture, but according to multiple documented accounts, it was something far closer to occupation. And at the center of it all was a man most history books barely mention. His name was Minor C. Keith. He did not wear a uniform. He did not command an army in the traditional sense. But by the early 20th century, he controlled something far more dangerous, an empire built not on land, but on dependency. And the world would come to know it as the beginning of what would later be called the Banana Wars. Minor Keith's story did not begin with power. It began with failure. In the 1870s, Keith arrived in Costa Rica as a young entrepreneur tasked with building a railroad through dense jungle terrain. The project was brutal. Disease spread rapidly. Workers died in staggering numbers. Financial collapse loomed constantly. According to historical records, Keith lost 3 of his own brothers during the construction. Most men would have left. Keith adapted. Instead of abandoning the failing railroad, he turned to the land surrounding it. Bananas grew easily in the tropical climate. They required little maintenance. And more importantly, they could be shipped quickly to the United States. At first, it was a side operation, but within years, it became something else entirely. A lifeline, and then a monopoly. The United States, at the time, was undergoing a quiet transformation. Industrialization had reshaped cities. Wealth was consolidating, and American consumers were beginning to crave something new. Cheap, exotic imports. Bananas were perfect. They were sweet, portable, and unlike anything grown domestically. Demand exploded, and Keith was ready. By the 1890s, he had secured vast land concessions from the Costa Rican government. In exchange for completing infrastructure projects, he was granted control over massive agricultural zones. Entire regions were no longer governed by local authorities. They were governed by contracts, and those contracts belonged to Keith. But Keith was not alone. Across the Caribbean and Central America, other businessmen were building similar operations. Competition intensified, supply chains expanded, and eventually, several of these ventures merged into a single corporate entity, one that would become infamous, the United Fruit Company. The name sounded harmless, almost mundane, but the truth was far darker. United Fruit did not operate like a traditional business. It controlled land, railroads, ports, and governments. In countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and Colombia, the company owned more than farmland. It owned infrastructure. It owned communication networks. And in many cases, it controlled political leadership. The term Banana Republic was not a metaphor. It was a description. Workers lived in company towns. They were paid in company-issued currency. They shopped at company-owned stores. And if they resisted, they were replaced. Or worse. According to multiple documented accounts, labor organizers who attempted to unionize were often met with intimidation, blacklisting, or outright violence. But these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a system designed to maintain absolute control over production at any cost. By the early 1900s, tensions were rising. Local populations began to understand what had happened. Their land had been leased, their governments had been influenced, and their economies had become dependent on a single export, bananas. But resistance required organization, and organization required time. Time it did not have, because United Fruit had something else, something far more powerful than land or money. It had influence in Washington. The United States government, driven by economic interests and strategic concerns, began to view Central America as a region that needed stability. But stability, in this context, had a very specific meaning. Governments that cooperated with American businesses were supported. Those that did not were replaced. This was the beginning of a new kind of warfare. Not declared, not always visible, but deeply effective. It would later be called the Banana Wars, a series of military interventions, occupations, and covert operations carried out by the United States across Latin America. Officially, these actions were framed as efforts to protect American citizens and maintain order. But investigators later discovered that corporate interests were often deeply intertwined with these decisions. And United Fruit was always nearby. The pattern became clear. A government would attempt to assert control over its own resources. Policies would be introduced, tax reforms, land redistribution, labor protections. And almost immediately, pressure would begin. Economic pressure, political pressure, and eventually military pressure. In Honduras, rival banana companies funded competing factions, turning internal conflicts into proxy battles. In Nicaragua, U.S. Marines were deployed repeatedly to secure political outcomes favorable to American business interests. In Haiti, occupation forces remained for nearly 2 decades. Each intervention followed a similar structure, and each one deepened the region's dependence. But the public narrative told a different story. Newspapers in the United States described these actions as necessary, civilizing missions, efforts to bring order to unstable nations. The film never showed the contracts. It never showed the financial incentives. And it never showed the men behind the decisions. Minor Keith, by then, had transitioned from entrepreneur to architect. His influence extended beyond agriculture. He helped shape the structure of a corporation that blurred the line between business and government. And as United Fruit expanded, so did its reach. It was no longer just exporting bananas. It was exporting control. But control is never absolute. And beneath the surface, something was beginning to change. Workers were talking. Local leaders were organizing. And governments, some of them, were starting to push back. One of those governments would become the breaking point. A moment when the quiet system of influence would turn into something far more visible and far more violent. It began with a reform, a policy that, on paper, seemed simple. Land that was not being used would be redistributed to the people. But that land belonged to United Fruit. And what happened next would expose the true nature of the empire. Because when profits were threatened, diplomacy was no longer enough. And the response would not come from businessmen. It would come from something far more dangerous. The first reports arrived quietly. Meetings behind closed doors. Communications between corporate executives and government officials. Plans being drafted. Strategies being discussed. And then, according to declassified documents years later, a decision was made. What followed would not be called a war. Not officially. But the consequences would reshape an entire region and leave a legacy that still exists today. Because in the shadows of plantations and boardrooms, a new phase was about to begin. One that would turn economic influence into direct intervention. One that would reveal just how far power was willing to go. And by the time the first shots were fired, it was already too late to stop it. And by the time the first shots were fired, it was already too late to stop it. The government in question was led by a man who believed the system could be changed from within. His name was Jacobo Arbenz. To some, he was a reformer. To others, he was a threat. But according to multiple documented accounts, Arbenz was not attempting a revolution. He was attempting a correction. In 1952, Arbenz introduced Decree 900. The policy was direct. And used land owned by large corporations would be expropriated and redistributed to landless farmers. Compensation would be provided, based on the value companies themselves had declared for tax purposes. On paper, it was legal, measured, even restrained, but the implications were enormous. The largest landholder in Guatemala was the United Fruit Company, and much of its land was not being used. Thousands of acres sat idle, held not for production, but for control. When the Guatemalan government moved to redistribute that land, United Fruit responded immediately. Not publicly, not through negotiation, but through influence. The company's leadership had spent decades building connections inside the United States government, and those connections now became active. Key figures within United Fruit had direct ties to powerful officials in Washington, including members of the U.S. State Department and the intelligence community. The narrative was quickly reshaped. Arbenz was no longer a reformer. He was labeled something far more dangerous, a communist. At the height of the Cold War, that accusation carried weight. It did not need to be proven. It only needed to be believed. Within months, discussions began inside the Central Intelligence Agency. Operation plans were drafted. Psychological warfare strategies were outlined, and a covert mission was approved. It would be known as Operation Success. The goal was simple: remove Arbenz from power. But this would not be a traditional invasion. There would be no official declaration, no acknowledgement of involvement. Instead, the operation relied on illusion. A small force of exiled Guatemalan fighters was assembled. They were led by Carlos Castillo Armas. On paper, they appeared to be a rebel army. In reality, they were supported, trained, and directed by the CIA. But the truth was carefully concealed. The real weapon was not the army. It was perception. According to declassified intelligence reports, the CIA launched a coordinated psychological campaign designed to convince Guatemala that a massive invasion was underway. Radio broadcasts were fabricated. Fake reports of troop movements were circulated. Aircraft conducted limited bombing runs, creating the illusion of overwhelming force. The objective was not to win a battle. It was to collapse morale, and it worked. Guatemalan military leaders, uncertain of the true scale of the threat, hesitated. Some believed a full U.S. invasion was imminent. Others feared internal collapse. And within days, the structure holding Arben's government together began to fracture. But the truth was far more calculated. The invading force was small. The military pressure was limited. The chaos was manufactured. Arbenz, isolated and under immense pressure, faced a decision: fight and risk total destruction, or step down. On June 27, 1954, he chose to resign. The official narrative framed it as a victory against communism. But investigators later discovered that the motivations were far more complex. Economic interests had played a central role, and United Fruit, once again, was at the center of it all. With Arbenz gone, Castillo Armas assumed power. Reforms were reversed. Land was returned, and the system that had existed before was restored. But something had changed. The illusion had been broken. The mechanisms of control, once hidden behind contracts and diplomacy, had been exposed, and the consequences would not remain contained. Across Latin America, governments were watching. Leaders who had considered similar reforms began to reconsider. Some abandoned their plans entirely. Others prepared for resistance. Because the message was clear: economic independence would not be tolerated if it threatened external interests. But Guatemala was only the beginning. The methods refined during Operation Success would be used again and again, sometimes with subtlety, sometimes with overwhelming force. In Cuba, tensions escalated toward open confrontation. In Dominican Republic, political instability was met with intervention. In Chile, economic pressure and covert operations would later shape the outcome of an entire government. Each case followed a familiar pattern: influence, destabilization, replacement. But the human cost was rarely documented in full. In Guatemala alone, the years following Arben's removal saw increasing repression. Opposition figures disappeared. Labor movements were dismantled. And what had once been a political struggle began to evolve into something far more violent: a civil war. It would last for decades. And according to historical investigations, tens of thousands would lose their lives. But the origins of that conflict traced back to a single decision, a single reform, and the response it triggered. The Banana Wars were never officially declared. They did not follow the rules of conventional conflict, but their impact was undeniable. They reshaped governments, they influenced economies, and they established a precedent that corporate interests could align with state power in ways that blurred every boundary. But the system was not without its weaknesses, because power built on control requires constant maintenance. And over time, cracks began to appear. Inside governments, inside corporations, and inside the very institutions that had carried out these operations. Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into investigations. And investigations began to reveal something dangerous. Not just what had been done, but how it had been done. Journalists started uncovering connections. Documents began to surface. And the narrative that had once seemed unquestionable began to shift. The image of stability was breaking, and with it, the protection that had allowed these operations to continue unchecked. But exposure alone was not enough to bring the system down, because those who had built it understood something critical. Control is easiest to maintain when the truth is fragmented, when responsibility is unclear, when accountability is delayed. And for a time, that strategy worked, but not indefinitely, because eventually, the consequences of decades of intervention began to converge. Economic instability, political unrest, and a growing distrust of external influence. The very systems that had been designed to maintain order were now producing the opposite. And somewhere within that chaos, a new phase was beginning, one that would not rely on quiet interventions or hidden operations. This time, the backlash would be visible, organized, and impossible to ignore, because the countries that had once been controlled were no longer willing to remain silent. And the empire that had shaped them for decades was about to face something it had never truly encountered before. It did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, almost invisibly, like pressure beneath the surface of the earth. For decades, the system had functioned through fragmentation. Governments were isolated, movements were suppressed before they could spread, and information rarely crossed borders in a way that could unify opposition. But by the late 20th century, that isolation was breaking down. According to multiple documented accounts, the first real threat to the system was not armed rebellion. It was exposure. Journalists, historians, and former officials began piecing together patterns that had once seemed unrelated. Corporate records, declassified intelligence files, eyewitness testimonies. Each fragment revealed something incomplete, but together, they formed a structure that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The name United Fruit Company began appearing not just in economic reports, but in investigations tied to political interference, military actions, and covert operations. The company that had once defined an industry was now becoming a symbol of something else: control. And as that perception spread, so did resistance. In countries across Latin America, grassroots movements began to organize with a different kind of awareness. They were no longer reacting to isolated events. They were responding to a system. In Guatemala, the aftermath of the 1954 coup had already set the stage for prolonged conflict. What began as political instability evolved into a full-scale civil war. Entire communities were caught in the crossfire. Villages disappeared. And according to later Truth Commission reports, state-backed violence escalated into acts that would be classified as genocide. But Guatemala was not alone. In Nicaragua, opposition to long-standing political structures led to revolution. In El Salvador, civil war erupted, fueled by decades of inequality and repression. In Honduras, the legacy of foreign corporate influence continued to shape internal conflicts and economic dependency. Each country had its own history, its own leaders, its own struggles, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. External control had created internal instability, and that instability was now feeding something far more unpredictable. The United States, once able to operate with relative opacity in the region, was now facing increasing scrutiny. Congressional hearings began to question past operations. Reports surfaced detailing covert interventions, and public trust, both domestically and internationally, began to erode. One of the most significant shifts came with the gradual release of classified documents. These files did not present a single narrative. They presented evidence. Evidence of coordination between corporate entities and government agencies. Evidence of psychological warfare campaigns. Evidence of interventions that had been publicly denied for years. But the truth did not arrive cleanly. It arrived in fragments. And those fragments forced a confrontation with something uncomfortable. The banana wars were never just about bananas. They were about power. And power, once exposed, becomes unstable. By the 1970s, the corporate landscape itself began to change. The United Fruit Company, facing mounting criticism and financial pressure, restructured and rebranded. It would later become Chiquita Brands International. The name changed. The branding softened. But the history remained. And that history was becoming harder to ignore. Legal challenges began to emerge. Victims of violence linked, directly or indirectly, to corporate operations sought accountability. Some cases moved forward. Many did not. But the process itself marked a shift. Because for the first time, the narrative was no longer controlled entirely by those in power. At the same time, global awareness was expanding. Human rights organizations documented abuses that had once gone unrecorded. Academic research traced economic dependencies back to their origins, and media coverage began to connect events across borders. The illusion of isolated incidents was collapsing. But collapse does not bring immediate resolution. In many regions, the damage had already been done. Economies remained dependent on export structures established decades earlier. Political systems carried the scars of repeated intervention, and social divisions, deepened by years of conflict, proved difficult to heal. The legacy of the Banana Wars was not a single event. It was a condition where sovereignty had been compromised, where external influence had shaped internal realities, and where the consequences continued long after the original actions had ended. Investigators later discovered that even as overt interventions declined, the structures they created persisted. Trade agreements, corporate influence, financial dependencies. These were quieter tools, but no less effective. And yet, resistance had changed as well. It was no longer confined to armed struggle. It had moved into courts, into universities, into international forums. Voices that had once been silenced were now being recorded, documented, analyzed. But the question remained: could exposure undo what had been built over nearly a century? The answer, according to most historical assessments, was complex. In some cases, reforms were implemented, land rights were revisited, labor protections were strengthened, and political systems became more representative. In others, instability persisted, corruption adapted, and external influence found new forms. The story did not end with a clear resolution, because it was never a single story. It was a network of decisions, a chain of actions, each one building on the last. And at the center of it all, a simple product remained: bananas. Cheap, accessible, ubiquitous. The fruit itself never changed, but the system behind it shaped nations. The film never showed the contracts signed in quiet rooms. It never showed the messages exchanged between executives and officials. And it never showed the long-term consequences of decisions made in the name of profit and stability. But the truth, once uncovered, does not disappear. It lingers. In archives, in testimonies, and in the lives of those who experienced its consequences. The Banana Wars were never officially declared. They were never formally concluded, but their impact remains embedded in the political and economic structures of an entire region. And according to multiple documented accounts, that impact is still unfolding.